Rivalries are fun. Some of you already know that I'm a little interested in the concept of new age college rivalries, especially considering that most rivalries in college sports are over 100 years old. It takes time and history between two programs to create a sense of dislike between teams, programs, and fan bases. But in a conference like the Big 12, there aren't as many peak rivalries as there have been. I'd say there's only 4 or 5 S-tier rivalries now. Will Texas Tech and Oklahoma State finally create the Dust Bowl? Will West Virginia and Cincinnati get chippy with each other? Who the heck does UCF circle on the schedule? Is it possible for a new rivalry to be born in the modern era? There are a few rivalries to look at here, with Texas A&M's manufactured game against LSU and Nebraska's game against Iowa. Both of these rivalries were born out of realignment necessity, but even with both of these, there are very real pre-existing senses of rivalry that go beyond the schools. Texas versus Louisiana has been a rivalry almost as old as the two states, and you'll never find an Iowan that doesn't have something to say about a Nebraskan and vice versa. The Nebraska-Iowa game specifically had been played for years. It's possible for rivalry games to pop up quickly, but sometimes a team tries to take it too far, and instead of a rival, it creates a laughingstock. Yukon doesn't have many rivals. A quick jump to their Wikipedia page reveals that they only have 3 official ones: UMass, Rhode Island, and Syracuse. Their main one, a rivalry with UMass, has been resumed as of recently, but even still, it's between 2 schools that haven't shared a conference since the FCS Yankee Conference. Yukon left for the FBS in 2000, and the battle for the New England Beanpot wasn't played again until UMass themselves moved up to the MAC over a decade later. It's been played every year since 2018, but that's been made a little easier since both teams had been independent since Yukon left the American in 2020. It's tied 38-2. But neither of these schools are really on the same level, and with the Minutemen rejoining the MAC, there's the possibility this game won't be played as often in the future. Their next rivalry is dormant against the FCS Rhode Island Rams. FBS-FCS rivalries almost never work. The two teams have only played 3 times since 2000, with the Huskies winning all of them. The last one makes a little bit more sense. Bleeding over from tensions in basketball, the rivalry between Yukon and Syracuse blew up during the team's time in the Big East, making it the youngest of Yukon's rivalries, but also potentially the biggest, due to the level of football both teams were playing at. But the rivalry effectively ended in 2012 when Syracuse left to join the ACC, leaving Yukon pretty much alone in the Northeast segment of the American Conference. Rivalries against Temple or Cincinnati didn't sound too exciting. That's where this story picks up. In 2013, with the admission of Central Florida into the American Athletic Conference from Conference USA. The Knights had one of the most convoluted routes to their conference in 2013, starting from D3 and lighting up like a NASA rocket over just a handful of years into the FBS. UCF's history with football had been on and off at that point. During their time in the Conference USA from 2005 to 2012, the Knights had 5 winning seasons to 3 seasons below 500. They went 2-3 in bowl games during that period and finished the season ranked only once in 2010. But in 4 of those 5 seasons, they'd gone to the CUSA championship game and won half of those games. By the time they'd reached the American, they were poised as a football power. Compare that to Yukon, who, during that same time span of 8 years, had split their success, the period at the end of Randy Edsall's first reign and some struggles under Paul Pasqualoni. You could argue that the two programs were coming into the American at equal places, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who'd believe you. UCF was in the fertile recruiting hotbed of Florida, and Yukon struggled to get airtime over hockey. In 2014, Yukon fired their former head coach and brought in our main character for today's story, Bob Diaco from Notre Dame. Diaco had been the defensive coordinator for a handful of Midwestern programs before his time taking over at Yukon. And if we know anything about the Midwest, it's that they have as much hatred, if not more hatred, than Southern teams do surrounding their rivals. He knew that in order for his team to care, they had to have something to play for, and that more often than not, that meant someone to play against. A rising tide raises all ships sort of thing. UCF, meanwhile, was riding high. The Knights had gone 12-1 and won the American in their first year, and also were content on a pre-existing vibrant rivalry, the war on I-4 against the USF Bulls. The war on I-4 carries with it 85 miles of anger and resentment, from USF stealing UCF's thunder as an ascending team and blocking the Knights' entrance into the Big East, to the Knights swiftly overtaking USF as a better team. Even today, while the schools aren't in the same conference anymore, the tone between the two fan bases is best described as bitter. UCF was the best team in the conference. UConn was the worst. So, of course, when the two teams met in 2014, UConn won. It was, admittedly, the only bright spot of the season for UConn, who finished the year at 2-10. But because of that, Coach Diaco absolutely latched on to UCF as the biggest game of the season for UConn. In the American, UConn was all alone in the Northeast. None of their rivals were in conference, and there wasn't much of a chance that Temple would suddenly become one for them. But lots of their players on roster were from Florida. But since there wasn't much of a chance UConn would get drastically better over just 1 or 2 seasons, he had to make it more interesting. So he created a trophy for it.
Maybe I'll with my money make a trophy. I'll buy it myself. Put a big giant husky and another big giant knight on it. Make a stand. Put it on our hallway. The civil conflict. The loser, maybe they got to put either like nutmeg on the stand when it's not there, and we'll put a sack of oranges.
Now, historically, trophies are typically based on some sort of historical or geographical connection between the two teams. Take, for example, the Dormant Telephone Trophy between Iowa State and Missouri, which is based on a pregame incident between both schools in 1959. The trophy Diaco created had none of that. It had the logos of the two teams embossed on a steel plate and then 10 little placards underneath to display the final score of each individual game. The first game, UConn's 37-29 victory, was the only score on the trophy itself. It was first revealed in a tweet from UConn's official football account, counting down the days until UConn's next matchup with the Knights in football. Only there was one problem. UCF couldn't care less about UConn. The Knights didn't even have any idea the trophy existed. UCF publicly denied any knowledge of the trophy or the rivalry, and their social media team was advised to ignore it. Coach O'Leary himself was blindsided by it. I didn't know anything about a trophy, a time thing, or anything else. My experience is you're more likely to have a rivalry against a team closer to where you live. The questions started to pile up, and so did the criticism. Diaco had to come back to the podium a week later to defend himself. They don't get to say whether they're our rival or not. We might not be their rival, but they don't get to say whether they're our rival. That's for us to decide. Instead of laughing it off and finding another way to motivate the team for a tough matchup, Diaco dug his heels even further. Why do I have to call their athletic department to say that we've got them targeted as our rival? What do I care what they think? If they don't want to be a part of the trophy, I don't care about that either, he told the New Haven Register. Sooner than later, October 10th, 2015 rolled around. UConn entered the game 2-3, and UCF was on a down skid at 0-5. Talk began to rise over what UCF would do if they magically won the game despite their losing streak. UCF's mascot Nitro seemed to have his own take on what would happen, and UCF officials stated they would only take the trophy if they had discussions with UConn, hinting at the fact that they not only had not had those conversations, but they did not intend to. After a strong game from quarterback Bryant Shareffs, UConn won anyway, 40-13, and hoisted the ConFLiCT trophy, now with the word "the" replacing "civil" for seemingly no reason whatsoever, off the field into the locker room. The Huskies left with bragging rights over a team that really couldn't care less. The real comedy came a year later, when the Knights did end up beating UConn in East Hartford 24-16, and promptly ignored the trophy. A UConn staffer went to give it to them, and they just flat out acted like it wasn't there. With the embarrassment loudly sitting on their own home bench, UConn finally covered it with a towel, like a high schooler in the lunchroom desperately trying to hide his botched haircut. Diaco tried his best to save face.
How many articles has your publication written on this one topic? How many conversations nationally have been on this one topic, talking about two teams that would have no relevance otherwise, and an energy for the conference and conference conversation about intrigue? So I don't really understand why it was a bad idea. I really don't. And I'm sorry to everyone that I had an idea. So what's your idea?
Before too long, Diaco's experiment of coaching the Huskies was also ended, and he was fired after the 2016 season. After that 2016 game, the trophy disappeared. Scott Frost didn't want it at UCF. Nobody knew where it went. A few fakes were brought up, and UCF even used a fake for a promotional video for a game against UConn. When the Knights beat UConn in 2019, the last season the Huskies were in the American Conference, the trophy made another appearance, literally just to make fun of UConn. UCF Athletic Director Terry Mahajer even said, "It's kind of funny. It's in our possession because we won the last game." Ironically enough, if you look at it in the same way that Diaco had talked about the reason for starting it, the civil conflict was a complete and total success. People got to talking about it. Writers who otherwise didn't care about the game between Yukon and UCF now found something interesting to write about. Even by making himself and his team the laughingstock of college football, Diaco had succeeded, and he's still succeeded. We're still talking about that one time a college team just decided they were going to be somebody's rivals with absolutely zero input from the other fan base supposedly involved. Since then, it's been brought up with new vigor during the Big 12's seemingly endless on-again, off-again flirtation with the Huskies, and whether or not the trophy would return, given UCF's similar lack of rivalries in the modern Big 12, finding them in a situation similar to UConn's in 2014. The conflict has etched itself into college sports lore and will never be forgotten. But what do you guys think? Should the civil conflict come back? Should the civil conflict come back? Or will it be forever lost to history? As always, let me know how you think in the comments below. Be nice to each other. I'll see you next time.